Have you ever looked at an old photograph and noticed something that shouldn't be there? Something that makes your skin crawl and your mind race with questions? Today, we're diving into one of the most unsettling photographic mysteries from the early 20th century. A seemingly innocent picture of children at play that hides something far more disturbing. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. The afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows of the Springfield Historical Society's archive room, casting long shadows across rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes. Margaret Chen, a 34-year-old archivist with 15 years of experience handling historical documents, carefully lifted another cardboard box from the shelf. The label read, "Donations 2019, Miscellaneous." It was October 2019, and she had been tasked with cataloguing a recent estate donation from the Patterson family, one of Springfield's oldest lineages. Margaret's fingers, protected by white cotton gloves, sorted through yellowed letters, faded receipts, and brittle newspaper clippings. The smell of aged paper filled her nostrils, a scent she had grown to love over the years. Her colleague, David Torres, sat at the adjacent table, methodically entering data into the Society's digital database. The quiet hum of the climate control system was the only constant sound in the otherwise silent room. "Another box of the usual stuff," Margaret said, not looking up. "Birth certificates, property deeds, some correspondence from the 1920s. David nodded without breaking his concentration. "The Patterson donation is massive. We'll be sorting through this for months." Margaret reached deeper into the box and felt something different, the rigid edge of a photograph album. She pulled it out carefully, noting the worn leather cover and tarnished brass corners. The binding creaked as she opened it, revealing black pages with photographs mounted using corner tabs, some of which had long since lost their grip, leaving images loose between the pages. The photographs were typical of the era, stiff portraits of stern-faced individuals, group shots of what appeared to be family gatherings, images of houses and streets that no longer existed. Margaret had seen thousands of such photographs. Each one was a window into a world that had vanished, preserved only in silver gelatin and fading memories. Then she turned to a page near the middle of the album. A photograph, larger than the others, showed a group of children in a backyard. The image quality was remarkably good for its age. 7 children, ranging from what appeared to be 5 to 12 years old, were captured mid-play. Some were frozen mid-run, others laughing with their mouths open wide. A girl in a white dress held a hoop, while 2 boys appeared to be in the midst of a game of tag. The scene radiated the carefree joy of childhood in a simpler time. Margaret smiled at the image, appreciating the photographer's skill in capturing such a spontaneous moment. In 1908, when photography required long exposure times and cumbersome equipment, action shots like this were rare. The photographer must have used a relatively fast shutter speed, which was uncommon for the period. She was about to turn the page when something caught her eye. Between 2 of the children, a boy in knickers and a girl with long braids, there was a distortion. At first, Margaret thought it was a flaw in the photograph itself, perhaps a development error or damage to the negative. But as she looked closer, bringing the album nearer to her face, she realized it was something else entirely. There was a shape, vague and indistinct, but unmistakably present. It had a human-like form, a suggestion of a head, shoulders and torso, but it appeared translucent, as if only partially there. The figure seemed to be standing among the children, yet it was different from them in every way. Where the children were sharp and clear, this form was blurred and ethereal. Where the children cast distinct shadows on the grass, this figure had no shadow at all. "David," Margaret said, her voice slightly higher than usual, "come look at this." David rolled his chair over to her table, curiosity evident on his face. Margaret pointed to the area between the 2 children. David leaned in, squinting at the photograph. "Is that a development flaw?" he asked. "I thought so at first," Margaret replied. "But look at the shape. It's too consistent, too structured to be random. And it's only in this one spot. The rest of the photograph is perfectly clear." David studied the image for a long moment. Could it be double exposure? Maybe someone accidentally exposed the plate twice. Possible, Margaret conceded. But if that were the case, we'd expect to see other overlapping elements. The backgrounds would blend. This is isolated to just this one area. They sat in silence, both staring at the mysterious form. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, though she couldn't articulate why. There was something deeply unsettling about the figure's presence in what should have been an innocent scene of childhood play. "We should scan this at high resolution," David suggested. "Maybe we can see more detail with digital enhancement." Margaret nodded, carefully removing the photograph from the album. On the back, written in faded ink, was a notation: "Patterson Children, Summer 1908, Backyard Garden." No mention of anything unusual, no explanation for the strange presence in the frame. As Margaret carried the photograph to the scanning station, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something significant, something that would raise more questions than it could ever answer. The children in the photograph had been dead for decades, their laughter silenced by time. But whatever else was in that photograph, that translucent, watching form, remained a mystery that transcended the years. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me continue creating this content. The following morning, Margaret arrived at the Historical Society an hour earlier than usual. She had barely slept, her mind occupied by the photograph and its mysterious occupant. She had spent the previous evening researching photographic anomalies from the early 20th century, reading about spirit photography, double exposures, and various technical errors that could create unexpected images. Spirit photography had been popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s, with fraudulent mediums superimposing ghostly figures onto photographs to convince grieving families that they could communicate with the dead. But those images were usually obvious fakes, too perfect, too deliberately placed. The figure in the Patterson photograph was different. It was subtle, almost accidental in its appearance. Margaret unlocked the archive room and went straight to her workstation. The high-resolution scan from the previous day was saved on her computer. She opened it in the image processing software, her fingers trembling slightly as she manipulated the controls. The digital scan was remarkably detailed, capturing every nuance of the original photograph at 1200 dpi. Margaret zoomed in on the area where the translucent figure appeared. As the pixels expanded across her screen, she gasped audibly. With the enhanced detail, the figure became more defined, yet somehow more disturbing. The form clearly had humanoid characteristics. There was a distinct head shape and what appeared to be facial features, though they were too blurred to make out clearly. The body seemed to be wearing clothing, possibly a long coat or dress that extended to where knees might be, but the edges of the figure were soft and indistinct, fading gradually into the background as if the person was made of mist rather than solid matter. What struck Margaret most forcefully was the figure's position. It wasn't simply in the background or accidentally caught in the frame. It was positioned deliberately among the children, as if it had been part of their group. Yet none of the children appeared to acknowledge its presence. Their gazes were directed at each other or at some unseen point beyond the camera. They showed no fear, no awareness of the translucent form standing mere feet away from them. Margaret adjusted the contrast and brightness, hoping to reveal more detail. As she did, something else became apparent. The figure appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Unlike the children, whose attention was scattered in various directions, this form seemed to be staring straight at the photographer with an intensity that was palpable even through the deterioration of time and the limitations of technology. "Still at it?" David's voice made Margaret jump. She hadn't heard him enter the room. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you," he said, setting his coffee cup on his desk. "Find anything new?" Margaret gestured to her screen. "Look at this enhancement. The figure is much clearer now. And David, I think it's looking at the camera." David pulled up a chair and studied the enlarged image. His usual skeptical expression gradually shifted to one of concern. "That's unsettling. Have you found any information about the Patterson family? Maybe there's context we're missing." "I was about to search the records," Margaret said, minimizing the image software and opening the society's genealogical database. She typed Patterson, Springfield, 1908, and waited as the system searched its extensive files. The results populated quickly. The Patterson family had been prominent in Springfield since the town's founding in 1821. They had owned a successful textile mill and several properties throughout the area. The family line was well documented, with birth records, death certificates, property transfers, and newspaper mentions spanning over a century. Margaret found the relevant entry for 1908. Thomas Patterson and his wife Eleanor had 7 children: William, age 12, Mary, age 10, Robert, age 9, Elizabeth, age 8, Catherine, age 7, James, age 6, and little Sarah, age 5. The ages matched the apparent ages of the children in the photograph. "7 children," David observed. "Count the children in the photograph." Margaret switched back to the image and counted carefully. 7 children, all accounted for. "So the figure isn't an 8th child who was left out of the records," David said. "It's something else entirely." Margaret continued searching through the Patterson family records, looking for anything unusual around 1908. Marriage records, business documents, social announcements in the local newspaper, everything appeared normal. The Pattersons were a respectable, affluent family with no apparent tragedies or scandals. Then, buried in a stack of digitized newspaper clippings, Margaret found something, a brief article from the Springfield Gazette, dated September 15, 1908, just a few months after the photograph was likely taken. The headline read, "Local photographer retires, citing ill health." The article was short. Mr. Edmund Blackwood, longtime photographer and proprietor of Blackwood Studios on Main Street, has announced his retirement effective immediately. Mr. Blackwood, age 42, cited declining health as the reason for his departure from the profession he has practiced for 20 years. His studio and equipment will be sold at auction next month. Mr. Blackwood was known for his skill in portrait photography and his work documenting Springfield's prominent families. Margaret felt a chill. Edmund Blackwood would have been one of the few professional photographers in Springfield capable of producing a photograph of such quality in 1908. Could he have been the one who took the Patterson photograph? And if so, did his sudden retirement have anything to do with what appeared in his images? "We need to find out more about Edmund Blackwood," Margaret said, her voice determined despite the growing unease in her stomach. "Leave a comment below about what you think of this story so far." Margaret spent the next week diving deep into research on Edmund Blackwood. The Historical Society's records contained surprisingly little about the man himself, despite his 20-year career documenting Springfield's most prominent families. There were examples of his work: formal portraits of stern-faced men and women in their finest clothes, carefully composed group photographs, images of storefronts and buildings commissioned for business purposes. What was missing was any personal information. No family records, no birth certificate in Springfield's archives, no marriage license. Edmund Blackwood appeared in the town records only as a business owner who paid his taxes on time and advertised his services in the local newspaper. When he left, he seemed to simply vanish from history. David had been helping with the research when his work schedule allowed. One Thursday afternoon, he burst into the archive room with unusual energy, holding a manila folder. "Margaret, I found something," he said, slightly out of breath, I was searching property records, thinking maybe Blackwood owned his studio building and there might be a paper trail. I didn't find that, but I found something else." He opened the folder and spread several photocopied documents on the table. They were commitment papers from Riverside Psychiatric Hospital in the neighboring city of Ashford, dated October 1908. "Edmund Blackwood was institutionalized," David explained. "1 month after he closed his studio." Margaret picked up the documents with shaking hands. The commitment order was signed by a Dr. Harold Pemberton and included a brief description of the patient's condition. Subject exhibits severe nervous disorder, persistent insomnia, and reports disturbing visual phenomena. Subject claims to see presences in his photographic plates that are not visible to others. Condition has deteriorated to the point where subject is unable to fulfill basic social and professional obligations. Commitment recommended for subject's own safety and the safety of others. Visual phenomena in his photographic plates, Margaret read aloud. He saw things in his photographs. Things that others couldn't see, David added. Or maybe things that shouldn't be there at all. Margaret's mind raced. If Blackwood had been experiencing these disturbing visions consistently, the Patterson photograph might not be an isolated incident. There could be other images, other photographs where impossible things appeared when the plates were developed. Did he have family? Margaret asked. Someone who might have kept his personal effects, his other photographs? David shook his head. That's where the trail goes cold. The hospital records show he was a patient there until 1915, when he died of pneumonia. He's buried in Ashford Cemetery in an unmarked grave. No family claimed the body. His possessions were disposed of according to hospital policy. Disposed of? Margaret repeated, feeling a sense of loss. Whatever Blackwood had seen, whatever other mysterious images he might have captured, were likely lost forever. But David wasn't finished. However, he continued, pulling out another document, I found something interesting. A letter in the hospital's archived correspondence, written by Blackwood himself in 1910, 2 years after his commitment. He was writing to a colleague, another photographer named Samuel Wright in Boston. Margaret took the letter carefully. The handwriting was shaky but legible, written on thin hospital stationery. She read aloud, Dear Samuel, I hope this letter finds you well and that you do not judge me too harshly for my current circumstances. I know the rumors that must have spread about my sudden retirement and subsequent confinement. I wish to tell you the truth, for you are the only colleague I believe might understand. It began in the spring of 1908. I was developing a plate from a routine assignment, a family portrait, nothing unusual. But when the image appeared in the developing bath, there was something present that had not been there during the sitting. A figure, translucent and watchful, standing behind the family. I assumed it was a flaw in the plate or the chemicals. But when I examined the negative, the figure was there as well. At first, I said nothing. I destroyed the plate and the negative, retook the photograph. But it happened again and again. Different clients, different locations, but always the same result. These translucent figures appearing in my photographs, always watching, always present among the living subjects, but clearly apart from them. I began to dread developing each plate, never knowing what I might find. My sleep suffered. My hands began to shake. When I could no longer hide my distress from my clients, when I could no longer fulfill my professional obligations, I knew I had to stop. Samuel, I do not ask you to believe me. I barely believe it myself, even now. But I must warn you, if you ever see such things in your own work, do not dismiss them as mere flaws. There is something being captured by our cameras that our eyes cannot perceive. Whether it is some property of the photographic process itself, or whether we are documenting something that exists alongside our world, I cannot say. I only know that what I saw has cost me everything. Your friend, Edmund Blackwood. The archive room fell silent as Margaret finished reading. She carefully set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly. David stood motionless, processing the implications of Blackwood's words. He saw multiple figures, Margaret said quietly, in multiple photographs. This wasn't an isolated incident. And it drove him mad, David added. Or at least that's what everyone believed. But what if he wasn't mad? What if he really was seeing something? Margaret looked back at her computer screen, where the enhanced image of the Patterson photograph was still displayed. The translucent figure stood among the playing children, eternally frozen in that moment, eternally watching. "We need to find Samuel Wright's response," Margaret said. "If Blackwood wrote to him, maybe Wright wrote back. Maybe Wright knew something, found something." But even as she spoke, Margaret felt a growing unease. Every answer they found seemed to generate more questions. And the figure in the photograph seemed to stare back at her from the screen with an intensity that made her skin crawl. If you're still with me, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything. Margaret's obsession with the photograph and Edmund Blackwood's story began to affect her personal life. She found herself distracted during conversations with friends, her mind wandering back to the translucent figure and the photographer who had seen such things repeatedly. She started having dreams about developing photographs in a dark room, watching as impossible images emerged from the chemical bath, feeling the same dread that Blackwood must have felt. 3 weeks after discovering Blackwood's letter, Margaret received an email from David. He had been searching archives in Boston following the Samuel Wright lead. Wright had been a successful photographer in Boston during the same era, with a studio that operated until 1920. David had found Wright's business records, correspondence, and even some of his surviving photographs at the Boston Historical Society. Margaret drove to Boston that Saturday, unable to wait for David to send digital copies. She met him at the Boston Historical Society's research library, a grand building with marble floors and tall windows that let in the grey autumn light. "I haven't opened it yet," David said, gesturing to a cardboard box on the table between them. "I thought we should look at it together." The box contained Wright's personal correspondence, organized chronologically. David flipped through the files until he found the relevant year, 1910. There, in a folder marked "Received Personal," was a letter with Edmund Blackwood's name on the return address. "The original," Margaret breathed. "You found the original letter." "And Wright's response," David said, pulling out another sheet of paper. He kept a carbon copy. Wright's response was dated 2 weeks after Blackwood's letter. Margaret read it carefully. "Edmund, I received your letter with great concern for your well-being. I must confess, your description of these photographic anomalies troubled me deeply, not because I think you mad, but because I have experienced similar phenomena in my own work. Like you, I initially dismissed these occurrences as technical flaws, but they have persisted with troubling regularity. Unlike you, I have not spoken of them to anyone, fearing the professional and personal consequences you have suffered. I have developed a theory, though I admit it is based more on observation than scientific understanding. The photographic process captures light in a way that our eyes cannot fully perceive. The human eye sees only a narrow spectrum of light, but the photographic plate may be sensitive to wavelengths beyond our vision. Perhaps these figures exist in a realm of light that is visible only to our cameras. Or perhaps, and this is what troubles me most, they exist in the same physical space as we do, but at a frequency or vibration that our senses cannot detect. The camera, being a mechanical rather than biological observer, captures them alongside everything else in the frame. I have no solution to offer you, my friend. I can only tell you that you are not alone in seeing these things, and you are not mad. There is something here that we do not understand, something that challenges our conception of what is real and what is photographable. Take care of yourself, Edmund, and know that your observations, however disturbing, may one day be recognized as something more than delusion. Your colleagues Samuel Wright, Margaret, and David sat in stunned silence, Wright's theory was both fascinating and terrifying. If the camera could capture something that human eyes couldn't see, what did that mean for the nature of reality itself? How many of these figures existed, unseen and unknown, moving through the world alongside the living? "Look at the date on Wright's letter," David said suddenly. "November 1910. Now look at this." He pulled out another document from the box, a business ledger from Wright's studio. In December 1910, just 1 month after writing his response to Blackwood, Wright had abruptly reduced his business operations. By 1912, he had closed his portrait studio entirely and switched to architectural photography exclusively. "He stopped photographing people," Margaret observed, "because he didn't want to see what might be standing with them," David finished. They spent the rest of the day examining Wright's remaining photographs. The architectural images were precisely what one would expect: buildings, streets, interiors of churches and public spaces. No people, no translucent figures, nothing unexplained. But in a folder marked "Personal Archive," not for client delivery, they found rejected photographs from before 1910, portrait after portrait, each one showing the same disturbing phenomenon: translucent, human-like figures appearing among the subjects. Sometimes one figure, sometimes multiple. Always watching, always present, but somehow separate from the flesh and blood people around them. "There are dozens of them," Margaret whispered, "dozens of photographs with these figures. And these are just from one photographer," David added. How many other photographers saw these things? How many destroyed the evidence like Blackwood did? How many convinced themselves they were seeing flaws in their process? Margaret carefully photographed each image with her phone, documenting Wright's collection of impossible photographs. As she worked, she kept glancing at the figures in the images. They were all slightly different. Different heights, different builds, different postures. But they all shared that same translucent quality, that same sense of being present but not quite real. When they finished, it was nearly closing time. Margaret and David packed up their materials in silence, both processing what they had discovered. As they walked out into the cold Boston evening, Margaret spoke the question that had been growing in her mind all day. If these figures are real, if they're actually there, just invisible to our eyes, then that means they're everywhere, doesn't it? Standing next to us on the street, sitting in empty chairs, watching us from doorways. We just can't see them. David didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Maybe it's better that we can't." They drove back to Springfield in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret kept thinking about the Patterson children in that 1908 photograph, playing in their backyard garden with such innocent joy, completely unaware of the translucent figure standing among them. Were the children safe? Had they lived normal lives, grown old, died natural deaths? Or had something happened to them, something connected to that watching presence? She would never know. The Patterson children were all long dead. Their stories ended decades ago. But the photograph remained, and the figure in it remained, eternally watching, eternally present, a mystery that transcended time and understanding. Back in Springfield, Margaret couldn't let the story rest. She knew she should catalogue the Patterson photograph, file her research notes, and move on to other projects. The Historical Society had hundreds of other items waiting to be processed. Her supervisor had begun making pointed comments about her prolonged focus on a single photograph. But Margaret felt compelled to continue. She had become the keeper of a secret that Edmund Blackwood and Samuel Wright had carried alone. A secret that had cost Blackwood his career, his freedom, and ultimately his sanity. She felt she owed it to them to understand, or at least to try. In the weeks following the Boston trip, Margaret reached out to photographic historians, physicists, and even parapsychologists, carefully describing the phenomenon without mentioning her personal involvement. The responses varied widely. Some dismissed the figures as obvious double exposures or chemical artifacts. Others suggested more exotic explanations involving light refraction, quantum mechanics, or theoretical parallel dimensions. One physicist, Dr. Rebecca Hall from MIT offered an intriguing perspective during a phone call. The photographic process is essentially a record of light over time, she explained. The exposure might be a fraction of a second, but it's still a duration. In that duration, photons are being captured from sources we might not consciously perceive. If there were beings or entities that existed at a different vibrational frequency, and I'm speaking purely theoretically here, the camera might capture them during that brief exposure window. But why wouldn't we see them with our eyes? Margaret asked. Human vision is remarkably limited, Dr. Hall replied. We see a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. We can't see ultraviolet light, infrared light, radio waves or X-rays, yet they're all around us constantly. Who's to say there aren't other phenomena, other forms of presence that exist outside our sensory range? The conversation gave Margaret a framework to consider, but it didn't make her feel any better. If anything, it made the mystery more unsettling. The idea that there might be beings sharing our physical space, invisible to us but present nonetheless, was profoundly disturbing. Margaret also contacted the living descendants of the Patterson family, tracking down a great-grandson named Michael Patterson who lived in California. Over the phone, she explained about the photograph and asked if he knew any family stories about unusual events in 1908. I don't know much about that side of the family, Michael admitted. My great-grandfather was Robert Patterson, one of the kids in those old photos. He died when I was young, but I remember him as a sweet old man who told great stories about growing up in Springfield. Did he ever mention anything unusual about photographs? Margaret asked carefully. Funny you should ask, Michael said. I remember one thing. He was looking at old family photos with me once, and he got to one from his childhood. He stared at it for a long time, really intense, like he was seeing something that bothered him. Then he closed the album and said, "Some pictures show too much." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and changed the subject. Do you know which photograph he was looking at? No idea. Could have been any of them. But I remember thinking it was odd, you know. What could a picture show that would be too much? After the call ended, Margaret sat at her desk, staring at the enhanced image on her computer screen. Robert Patterson, the 9-year-old boy frozen mid-run in the 1908 photograph, had grown old enough to have great-grandchildren. He had lived his entire life knowing that something had been present during that summer day, something captured by Edmund Blackwood's camera, and he had never spoken of it, carrying that knowledge in silence until his death. David stopped by later that afternoon. He looked tired, and Margaret suspected she looked the same. Their investigation had taken a toll on both of them. I've been thinking, David said, sitting down heavily. Maybe we shouldn't publish this. Maybe we should just file the photograph and let it be. Why? Margaret asked, though part of her agreed. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, David replied. Blackwood went mad, trying to understand what he was seeing. Wright spent the rest of his career avoiding people so he wouldn't have to see it anymore. The Patterson kids knew something was there and chose not to talk about it. Maybe we should respect that silence. Margaret looked at the photograph again. The children, so full of life and joy, playing in the sunshine. And the figure, translucent and watchful, present but apart, captured for eternity in silver and gelatin. What do you think it wanted? Margaret asked quietly. Why was it there? Maybe it wasn't about wanting anything, David suggested. Maybe it was just there, existing alongside them in a way we don't understand. Not good, not evil, just present. Margaret nodded slowly. That perspective felt right somehow. The figure didn't look threatening or malevolent. It simply looked like it was observing, watching the children play, perhaps as curious about them as they might have been about it, had they been able to see it. We'll file the photograph, Margaret decided. We'll write up the research notes, but we won't make it public. We'll keep it in the archives for anyone who might come looking, but we won't advertise it. Agreed, David said, relief evident in his voice. That evening, as Margaret prepared to leave the Historical Society, she took one last look at the Patterson photograph. The translucent figure stood among the children, eternally frozen in that moment of summer sunshine and childhood laughter. She thought about Edmund Blackwood, dying alone in a psychiatric hospital, his warnings unheeded and his observations dismissed as delusions. She thought about Samuel Wright, giving up portrait photography to avoid confronting what he couldn't explain. She thought about Robert Patterson, living his entire life with the knowledge that something had been present during his childhood play, something that the camera had seen but his eyes could not. Some mysteries, Margaret realized, were meant to remain mysteries, not because they couldn't be solved, but because solving them wouldn't change anything. The figures would still be there, invisible and unknowable, existing in whatever realm they occupied. And the living would continue their lives, mostly unaware of the presences that moved among them, captured occasionally by the mechanical eyes of cameras, but hidden from human sight. Margaret turned off her computer, locked the archive room, and walked out into the crisp autumn evening. Somewhere in dimensions she couldn't perceive or understand, other beings might be walking beside her, sharing her space, but forever separate from her reality. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of acceptance. There were mysteries in the world that transcended understanding, and perhaps that was how it was meant to be. The 1908 Patterson photograph remains in the Springfield Historical Society's archives, catalogued but not displayed. Occasionally, researchers examining early photographic techniques will encounter it and ask questions. Margaret and David share what they know, carefully and without sensationalism, leaving others to draw their own conclusions. Edmund Blackwood's warnings went unheeded in his time, but his observations remain documented in Samuel Wright's correspondence. The translucent figures continue to appear in old photographs hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and courage to look closely enough to see them. What they are, why they appear, and what their presence means remains unknown. Perhaps they are glimpses into parallel dimensions or echoes of quantum possibilities that cameras capture but eyes cannot see. Perhaps they are something else entirely, something for which we have no framework or vocabulary. The mystery remains unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, but it endures, preserved in silver and gelatin, a testament to the limits of human understanding and the enduring power of questions that have no answers. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories about what the mysterious figure might have been. And if you're not already subscribed, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video.